A critical analysis of the budget and its impact from your side would be great.
1 second, just let me start my video. Okay, so I guess, okay. So let me start with this, the critical analysis. I'll go through some of the points that I have here. So first, what I see right now is that there's a more proactive involvement of the Ministry of Commerce in budget proposals, as well as in the push for tariff reforms. Now, this was something that was missing in the past, as FBR had assumed a more prominent role in tariff implementation. In recent times, the Advisor for Commerce and Investment, as you have seen, has proposed the reduction of indirect taxes and increasing the proportion of direct taxes in revenue collection. So there was this national tariff policy that was released in November 2019, and which is a step in the right direction, I feel, as it highlights some independence of the MOC in tariff policy building, which is a very important step, as it that will move away from what we sort of say as tariff. So the focus right now for tariffs is for revenue generation. That is something that needs to change, and tariffs should not be like the purpose of tariffs should not be that, right? So one of the major issues that Pakistan faces is that the large proportion of taxes collected are at import stages in total revenue. About 45% of revenue collected is at the import stage in Pakistan, compared to 21% by India, 28% by Bangladesh, and 10% by the more developed countries. Now, this over-dependence on custom duties and import stage tariffs has created challenges for exporters as well as local manufacturers, right? It increases the involvement of FBR in the tariff setting process and creates inefficiencies in production. This dependence on custom tariffs needs to be reduced, and the government needs to move from tariffs towards tackling non-tariff measures, right? So ensuring that the products that are imported into Pakistan meet standards and qualities that are at international level, rather than so that we do not face these poor quality products that can likely to be dumped into Pakistan at times, right? But I feel that this journey itself is likely to be on a very bumpy road. So secondly, there has been certain relief provided to various sectors, such as exemption of various custom duties on zero-rated products, along with the provision of duty-free concessions on imports. So we see that industries such as chemicals, leather, textile, rubber, and fertilizers have received several concessions. Now, on the other hand, though, there is this issue with turnover tax and minimum tax that is happening, and that has often been raised as a big concern. So a lot of these groups have said about the minimum tax as well as cascading tariffs that are likely to create distortions and end up favoring larger integrated composite units that incorporate different stages of production within their own entity rather than SMEs. So the SMEs end up paying more for in terms of when these minimum taxes and turnover taxes are imposed, right? So that's what's costly and creates inefficiencies. Now, another thing that is always there, that is always talked about, is the prevalence of the SRO culture and the tax favors associated with it that have done damage to our smaller businesses. Makes the tax, so these SROs, they make the tariff structure very complex. And the idea should be that tariff concessions provided to industries must be envisioned with a long-term strategy in mind, so that their businesses availing such concessions can undertake long-term strategies and commitments with their investors, rather than be subjected to these SROs and change in tax environment at the whims of the government official. Now, one thing amiss in the budget is the connection. Now, one thing that I see which is not there is the connection between these incentives provided by SBP and other sectors of the government and the FBR, right? So what they brought in the budget. So what I mean here is that SBR has provided significant relief to exporters and manufacturers under the Corona Relief Program. For instance, 8.6 billion was approved so far in refinance scheme for setting up new projects under its temporary economic relief facility, and rupees 107 billion has been so far approved for the refinance schemes under the Rozgar scheme. And then conditions on export finance scheme and long-term financing facilities have also been relaxed. But the federal government has also provided refunds to exporters. But again, what we should see is that a better integration in terms of the concessions offered by SBP and FBR. For example, those businesses availing concessions from SBP could have been provided with tax concessions on turnover taxes and sales, etc. as well. Right? So again, this could help incentivize documentation and improve tax collection in the end, because when businesses reach out to SBP, they have this other incentive of also reaching out to FBR, and then when it's better integrated, they would be better documented as well. So these things do matter in that sense, that the whole holistic approach should be taken into account rather than each department, government department acting separately. So I'll stop here. Thank you for the question.
Our valuation of the rupee and the anti-export bias have hurt our export. So if you could shed some light on the export situation in Pakistan in the last decade and what the major trend at the product level was, and how has COVID-19 impacted this trend?
Okay, thank you for the question, Reba. So yeah, let me start first with explaining the dire picture of export performance between 2011 and 2018. So I had data till 2018, so that's why I'm choosing that. So Pakistan was one of the worst performing countries in terms of its exports among lower and low middle income countries between 2011 and 2018. Now, export as a percentage of GDP was at 8%, and it was one of the lowest in the world, unfortunately. More importantly, only a handful of countries, with Pakistan as one of them, reported negative growth rates for their exports during this period. Overvalued currency, along with uncertainty in tariff rates, created this anti-export bias, right, which penalized exporters. And you saw that several exporters in Pakistan shifted their sales towards the domestic retail market. So we saw that the domestic retail market grew exponentially like during this period, while the exporters were shifting away from exporting towards the local market. The anti-export bias with policies discouraging exports in the last 10 years resulted in low level of investments in productive manufacturing activities that could boost exports. We saw little investment even in textile industry. We did not see the kind of investment that would actually lead to export growth once the currency did depreciate, right? So this lack of additional capacity limited export growth when the currency did depreciate. Although other constraints such as security, energy, etc., were improved and were during the latter part of the decade, the growth in exports did not increase as much as was expected more from the depreciation that took place. Again, why was that? The reason was that the exporters were at full capacity during the 2017 period where the depreciation had happened. And because they had not taken any BMR, they undertaken much BMR prior to the depreciation, the export growth itself was highly constrained and could have been much better. Now, another issue is that Pakistan focuses on the exports of products that have stagnated in terms of their world import demand. For instance, the global demand for textiles and leather products have grown at only 1% annually during this period, while that for vehicles and machinery has grown at 3% annually between 2011 and 2018. So the export basket that we have is low valued, but not only is it that, it doesn't have the import demand growth that we see in other products. The demand for value added consumer goods now, even within textile as well as leather products, right? The value added, the made up textile products, the apparels, the leather articles, they have increased at more than 2% annually during that period. But on the other hand, the counter side is that the demand for cotton inputs in the world, right? So the cotton inputs world is moving away from cotton inputs towards man-made fiber. We saw that. And there was this bigger push in the last decade. And because of that, the demand for cotton inputs has decreased at more than 3% annually during this period. Therefore, the focus must shift towards value addition in exports, also towards making sure that the right input mix is being used in our production that the world demands, right? Now, let me go to the COVID-19 impact on exports and try to answer that. So the textile industry, everybody knows, has been significantly impacted by the decline in exports due to COVID-19. Knitwear and bedwear have decreased by more than 50% in year-on-year exports between March and May 2020. That was a big jump. The recovery that we saw in 2019, that was highly negated, right? So when we saw the fall due to the COVID impact. For textile products was almost reversed. Ready-made garments increased at 12% between July and February this fiscal year, up till February and March, up to February 2020, we saw a large increase, a large spike in the ready-made garments at 12%, but then again, it dropped more than 40% in the previous 3 months during this COVID crisis. The sharp decline is a result of the extended lockdown again in both in EU and US, as well as the lockdown that we have in Pakistan, right? And because of the lockdown, etc., the impact on the exporters is that now they're facing a liquidity crunch and they're having further problems because the orders are getting delayed and they cannot finance, so they rely on the subsidies and the government financing facilities, the schemes that the various governments have provided, that becomes extremely critical to this time. Now, there are a handful of products in which Pakistan is said to have decent competitive advantage as well as cost advantage in terms of unit values of exports, right? So if we count on the fingers, we could actually do that, right? So for majority of the products exported, Pakistan faces stringent competition from regional counterparts. It is likely that our competitors are as likely to receive concessions from their own governments. So something like China and India, naturally, they will also come up and give concessions to their exporters and make it more difficult for our exporters to compete, because China and India also want their exports to revive, right? So this whole thing that we are not alone in this, right? But because of that, you're also facing this issues that other governments will also prop up their exporters. So what does the government need to do? Now it needs to step up its effect of lowering costs of production, reducing business constraints, and all that. It has to become much more intense. The lost contracts of a large proportion of exporters will need to be won again, and trading relations will need to be re-established, right? That's what we have discussed in this. However, there will be certain businesses that need immediate relief due to the nature of their product. So again, what will happen here is that there will be some businesses which are now more naturally sensitive to COVID crisis than other businesses, and that analysis needs to be done. That is where governments will need to become more foresighted in their approach, right? So that's what we'll see. So yeah, I'll end with this, and thank you for the question again.
Next question is for Dr. Aadil. What policy measures and firm level practices can enhance Pakistan's productivity to gain competitive advantage in the international markets?
Okay, thank you, Ariba, for this question. Yeah, this is a very good question. So let me first touch upon the firm level practices that I believe are essential in enhancing firm competitiveness in international markets. So my suggestions will mostly pertain to new and potential exporters, right? So I'll start with this. So apart from participation in trade fairs and exhibitions, which is essential for all businesses, export market intelligence is critical for exporters and sets the stage up for exporting. What I believe is that exporters must have information regarding the potential market size of selected export destinations, but must also be fully aware of the economic and political conditions prevailing in their targeted destination markets. It's very important to have that information, to tap into these resources, which something like the Economics Intelligence Unit, etc., that tell you about the markets that you're trying to target. And even looking up the international trade centers, trademap.org will give you a lot of information about the potential size of your exports. So undertaking research at the earlier stages of exporting, right, pre-exporting stages rather than at the later stages of exporting can help exporters. And the other point is that firms must know about the quality of their products and the conformity assessments, right, that we have mentioned, based on the standards and quality checks imposed by potential trading partners. So what generally happens is a lot of these producers, these are potential or new entrants, they don't know about the requirements, and suddenly they find that their consignments that they have sent into the import market has been rejected by the border officials because they did not meet certain standard and quality assessment requirements, and they then report a loss on their whole consignment due to that. Right? We hear about some mangoes being exported and they had some issues, and the whole consignment of all exporters related to that can get banned. So this happened in the seafood industry, I think, about a few years ago, where they reported a significant loss to their exports to EU because some of the exporters did not meet the requirements that they had imposed here on them. So although this information should be readily available, the onus still lies on the exporters, and it is their job to find out more about them. Now let me come to the government side policies to boost productivity. So ensure that firms have access to all types of inputs, domestic or imported. This is actually very important, and Gonzalo has quite a few times mentioned that they require, and that at globally competitive price. So firms should have access to those inputs that they need, right? Innovation in production and process is tied to the ability of firms to get the best, procure the best inputs at the cheapest possible price within the quickest possible time possible. Therefore, import policy must ensure that firms have not only easier access to inputs, the prices are globally competitive, and the time delay in getting the goods from the ports to the factory is reduced. Although, so my recommendation itself could be a bit ambitious, but small steps, right, are needed, and they could include adoption of digital technologies for trade facilitation and improving the communication between exporters and various trade officers you have around the world. Now, the government must enhance the role of SMEs in exporting. This is highly critical, that SMEs need to become more proactive in this, and that role of SMEs needs to be more important. Unfortunately, exporting activities in Pakistan are limited to large firms. Top 1% of exporters ranked in terms of their export sales dominate 60% of textile exports, 67% of leather and hide exports, and 40% of prepared food exports. So this is highly unequally distributed towards those large exporters. The top 1% exporters with their in-house capabilities and access to funds typically export multiple products to multiple destinations, and they're able to do that because they have the export market intelligence. They have a lot of departments that are working, and they even have buying houses in or agreements with buying offices even in foreign countries that are setting up a lot of export orders for them, which these small SMEs don't have. So again, this is mainly due to high, so one of the things is that smaller exporters are usually start with exporting to a single destination market with limited potential. Again, this is mainly due to high fixed costs associated with entering new markets and introducing new products. Unfortunately, the top exporters are highly concentrated within the textile industry. So again, we see that textile industry is dominated by the large exporters, and they are mostly concentrated in that. The role of SMEs is again crucial in export diversification, and they can play a very important role. And it all depends on their ability to generate information on their potential markets, and that's what's important, right? So, and the SMEs can play a very important part in participating in global value chains. Now, to close, let me point out a major menace that has hurt competitiveness of Pakistani producers and is tied to the high tariff culture prevalent in the country. It results in inefficiencies as well as misreporting, right? So the government must eliminate the curse of under-invoicing and misinvoicing rampant in Pakistan. Now, this is again a result of high tariff rates on products that is more effective for the importer to under-declare the volume of imports than pay taxes on it. So this is what happens. So the government is not able to generate revenue because it has posed such a high tariff on those products that the importers are misdeclaring or under-invoicing, right? Again, we need digital solutions to take care of this menace because this is resulting in uncompetitive practices. And again, we need effective border controls for that. So a lot of these things come up, and I'll close my, with this, I'll end my answer. And thank you again for this question.
When this government came in power, they suppressed imports, and at that time probably they didn't realize the unintended consequences of suppressing imports. So how do governments take such decisions and they don't think about such consequences, that they are going to have reduction in revenues, they are going to have reduction of the cost of increasing cost of input to exporting sectors. So what you say about that decision that government took, and whether it was deliberate decision to suppress imports, or there was no other choice available to the government?
This is a highly, it's an interesting and I think a debatable thing, right? We were all debating about this. But now if you look at the, one of the things that happened was, what was the result of this suppressing of imports? It led to, yes, the trade deficit. The idea was, as Madam Shandana said, that was to first tackle the trade deficit. The rising trade, we had a trade deficit of $36 billion when this government came into power, and that needed to be tackled, brought down, because we did not have the money to finance it. We did not have at that time, we were highly in need of these foreign reserves, and we could not spend it on financing imports. But then again, the cost was that it brought inefficiencies, it lowered growth, all that, because our growth, our whole economy was running on those imports that were being imported. So there was this whole cycle, right? It's a very catch-22 situation here. At that time, the government, because it had to reduce, so it had to go for it. Now, the fallout was, naturally, you have a hit on the inputs. The inputs, you couldn't find that. Your exporters, now exports itself is based on a lot of inputs that you require, and they have to be easily accessible. You cannot export if you're not competitive. If you cannot attain your inputs competitively, you will likely then suffer. So how does China ensure that it's a very strong exporter? It gets its advantage by ensuring that its inputs that it gets from around the world through its, BRI initiative. That's why the BRI initiative is very important, is that it can get those inputs easily. It's making those investments in Africa, in Latin America, where it can get those inputs that it needs to produce. It's now going to send through this CPEC. One of the reasons for CPEC was, again, so that it could bolster its western side and bring factories where it had a chance to, again, lower production costs, because they say that the labor there is cheaper than the labor in the eastern seaboard. So again, this whole thing, so whole question comes up is that, but there's the other side to it now. Now, if you put high tariffs and if you start limiting your imports, even your finished goods, if you end up limiting those, it can cause a lot of inefficiencies here, because the problem is once you kick out competition, the fact that then there's an issue with the local inefficiencies. So local inefficient players who cannot be competitive in the world market but find space in the local market start. So again, there's this whole anti-export bias that comes in because you have put high tariffs on chocolates or whatever it is that you were once trying to export or trying to sell and be competitive in. So there's this whole trade-off that we have to really take care of. The urgent need there was definitely to reduce the trade deficit, but then we could have heard one of the reasons was that our local industries had become highly import dependent, and because of that, if you stop imports suddenly, they will be hurt. So again, it's a catch-22 situation. There is no clear answer. One way or the other, there is a cost to it, and it depends on what cost at that time is more important. So at that time, the government felt that deficit, the fine was much more critical than the fact that the inefficiencies we would face because of those imports. Restriction of imports, sorry.